Hello comrades, it's TheFinnishBolshevik. Let's continue our series on political economy. This time we are in chapter 10, Rotation of Capital, 3 Forms of Industrial Capital. One of the conditions of existence of the capitalist mode of production is developed commodity circulation. That is, exchange of commodities through the medium of money. And as you probably remember from previous episodes, capital always starts as money. So not all money is capital, but capital always starts as money. When capital is in the form of money, we call it money capital. What's the difference between money and capital? Well, I have a whole dedicated episode on what money is, but basically, if it's gold, then it's a commodity that is usually exchanged for another commodity of roughly equal value. Of course, gold has some other uses too, like in computers and whatnot, or in jewelry, but when we're talking about money, it's used for exchange, and also various other things like accumulation, and things like that. Okay, so how is that different from capital? Capital is money that is invested in one form or another into the exploitation of the workers in order to create more value, because all value comes from labor. So the only way for capital to grow is by exploiting labor. Of course, not all capital is associated with production. You can have capital that is invested into market speculation, so you buy something, you wait for the price to go up, or you buy a house and then you rent it. There are several kinds of non-productive types of investments. I'm not really gonna get into it here, but even in those cases, like the moneylender's profit or the landlord's profit, they are all still derived from labor, even though only indirectly. And it's easy to understand why. It's because only labor creates value. And merchant's profit, if you buy something cheap and you sell it for expensive, that doesn't create any value. It only takes some of the value from somebody else and gives it to you, but it doesn't create any new value. If everybody did that, we would just be circulating the value with nothing new added. But anyway, let's get to the point. So first, capital is money capital. The capitalist uses this money to buy commodities of certain kinds. 1, means of production, and 2, labor power. You already know what those are, so I'm not going to go into it. Now, this begins the circulation process. And this act of circulation is represented like this. M to C, and then within C there is L/PM. M means money, C means commodities, L means labor power, and PM is means of production. I don't know why it's PM and not MP, but it doesn't matter. So what's happening in this formula is that money is turned into commodities, and then those commodities are of two kinds, labor power and means of production. So basically, the capitalist has used money to buy those things. So now, the capitalist has all that he needs to start production. So his money capital is now turned into productive capital. The first phase in the movement of capital is the transformation of money capital into productive capital. And you know what happens next. Since the capital has bought the means of production, the machines, and he has hired some laborers, he puts the laborers to use the means of production to churn out some new commodities for him. The commodities that result from this process are called commodity capital. Because this is basically just a transformation process. First we have money capital, the money capital turns into productive capital, the productive capital churns out commodity capital. Sure, there's money circulation as a separate thing and commodity circulation as a separate thing, but what's really happening here is the value that was in the money went into the machines and the labor power, and then now it's gone into the commodities. Of course, there's probably some of it still left in the machines. The machines are still there, although somewhat used. They have some wear and tear now, but nonetheless. So at first, the capitalist turned his money into commodities, and now we've ended up with commodities again, but these commodities that we have now are different than the commodities that we started out with. We started out with machines and labor power, and now we have some other commodities, probably a consumer item, let's say microwaves. And now this is the important thing to understand. The commodities that we have now, for example the microwaves, they're more valuable than the commodities we had at the beginning. At the beginning we had the machines and the labor power. Of course, not all of the value in the machines has been expelled yet, but once it's all been expended, once the machines are completely used and all the raw materials and everything is completely used, the resulting commodities are actually more valuable than the commodities that we started out with. Now, how is that possible? It's possible because the value that was embodied in the machines and the raw materials, that was all transferred into the new commodities. But labor power creates more value than it itself contains. Because as you know from previous episodes, the value of labor power is determined by how much value is required to maintain the laborers, but the laborers can produce a lot more value than just their own upkeep. Otherwise, capitalist profit would be impossible, and any kind of surplus would be impossible. So, this process can be depicted like this. We have C containing L and PM, and then ellipses P and ellipses C prime. That means commodities, which are of two kinds, labor and means of production. The ellipses just mean that time has passed, and P means production. So what's happening is commodities that are labor power and means of production are put into production, and at the other end comes out C prime, so commodities of higher value. You know, a more simple version of this would just be C ... P ... C prime. So commodities, production, more valuable commodities. Thus, the second phase in the movement of capital consists of the transformation of productive capital into commodity capital. Of course, this is just a simplification. This is happening lots of times. The capitalist, he's gonna repeat the process. He has multiple cycles like this going on all the time, probably. But we're analyzing just one individual case just for simplicity's sake. So the process, of course, doesn't stop here. The capitalist, he's not really interested in microwaves. He's interested in money, right? So he started out with money, turned it into machines and labor power. Now he's turned it into microwaves, which are more valuable than the stuff he started out with, but he wants to get the money out of it. So then he sells the microwaves, which is depicted as C prime to M prime. So now we're back at the beginning. We're back with money again, but it's not M, it's not money, it's M prime, which means more money. A more simple way of showing this process is just MC M prime, this whole thing. So started out with money, put it into commodities, ended up with more money. But it's important to realize that this was not just buying and selling, this was investing into actual production. And now that the capitalist has ended up with money again, he starts the process over. So, capital goes through these different phases. Industrial capital also passes through these different phases in the course of its movement. And by industrial capital, we mean all capital that is used for the production of commodities, regardless of whether it's actually like machinery and those kinds of industry, or if it's agriculture or something like that. It's still called industrial capital. And Marx says in Capital, Volume 2, quote, "Industrial capital is the only form of existence of capital in which not only the appropriation of surplus value or surplus product, but also its creation is a function of capital. Therefore it gives to production its capitalist character. Its existence includes that of class antagonism between the capitalist and laborers." So it's kind of peak capitalism. If you had just buying and selling, then you would have the appropriation of the value, assuming that somebody actually gets a profit, then yeah, there would be profit appropriation. If you have landlordism, yeah, you have profit appropriation there, but you don't have the production. But in industrial capital, it combines the production of the value and also the appropriation of the value. The capitalist, he starts out with money, he ends up with more money, and it was all created in that process. It's capitalism at its simplest. So capital, it circulates, it has three phases, and of these three phases, the first and the third take place in the form of circulation, and the second one, the middle one, takes place in the stage of production. And all of these are absolutely required. It simply would not work if even one of them was missing. The whole process can be shown like this. M to C, and the C contains labor power and means production, which turns into production, or P, which turns into commodity prime, which then turns into M prime. The rotation of capital proceeds normally only so long as its various phases flow uninterruptedly one into the other. If there's a problem in the first phase, then the capitalist, he has some money, but he can't invest it into anything, so nothing happens. If there's a problem in the second phase, he tries to produce, he hires the guys, he buys the machines, but something goes wrong. He can't get raw materials, or he has some kind of problem that just halts the production. So then he just ends up with a bunch of machines that don't do anything for him. And if there's a problem in the last phase, which is maybe the most common, or at least it's like the most classic, I don't know, most iconic, this is usually what people imagine when they imagine a crisis, is not a lack of investment opportunities, lack of places to put the money, or lack of raw materials or something. That's not usually the case. It's the problem usually occurs with the last phase. So you've done everything, you've made the stuff, you've made the microwaves or whatever, but you can't get them sold. So that's if the problem happens at the last phase, you have a bunch of commodities and you just can't get them sold. Or, at least not all of them. Or, maybe not at full value, maybe you have to sell them below their value to even get rid of them. To the three phases of capital correspond three forms of industrial capital, so money capital, productive capital, and commodity capital. Every capital exists simultaneously in all these forms, at the same time as one part of it appears as money capital being transformed into productive capital, another part appears as productive capital being transformed into commodities, and a third part appears as commodities being turned into money again. But just for the simplicity of analysis, we look at it like chronologically. But, if they're making Snickers, you can buy the Snickers all the time. It's not like they have to go like, okay, first we put the money in, then we work, for a couple weeks, then we get the Snickers out, and then you can turn them into money again, and then you start off no, it's constant. The guys are working, but while they're making their Snickers bars, at the same time there's already Snickers bars at the stores that people are buying. And at the same time, salaries are being paid and machines are being bought or upgraded or whatever. So all three steps actually take place at the same time in a repeating loop. Each part of it in turn assumes and discards one after another all three of these forms. This is true not only of each capital taken separately, but also of all capitals taken together, or in other words, of the aggregate social capital. Therefore, Marx declares that capital can be understood only as a movement and not as a thing lying at rest. So, capital is not a pile of money, or a machine, or even a building, or a truckload of microwaves. No, capital is more of a process. It's not tied to any specific form, and those forms are also not tied to it. So you could have microwaves that are not capital. Let's say if I make a microwave for myself, that's not capital. Or if I make a microwave for a friend, that's not capital. If I have money, but I just don't invest it, if I, use it to buy a microwave for personal use or whatever, if I just have money that is not used for investing in exploitation, then it's not capital. I could even have a heavy piece of machinery, but if it's not used for the exploitation of labor power, it's not capital. At the same time, capital has to have some kind of form, but it doesn't matter what the form is. This includes the possibility of distinct existence of the three forms of capital. The book says that later on it will be shown how merchant capital and loan capital are separated off from capital employed in production. It is this distinction that provides the basis for the existence of different groups of the bourgeoisie, manufacturers, merchants, bankers, who share out the surplus value amongst themselves. But we'll talk about that more later. Then let's talk about turnover of capital, time of production and time of circulation. Every capital undergoes a rotation or turnover. Turnover is not something that is a momentary or one-time act, but it is more like a periodically renewed and repeated process. The period of turnover of capital is the sum of the time of production and the time of circulation. Now remember, in the previous part, we talked about how the three different phases are money, commodities, and production, and then money again. So the turnover time is all of those combined. So in other words, the period of turnover is the interval of time which elapses between the moment when capital is invested in a certain form to the moment when it returns to the capitalist in the same form but increased by the amount of the surplus value. Surplus value created by the workers in the production process. The time of production is the time during which the capital is in the sphere of production. Most of the time is occupied by the materials being actually worked on, having actual labor performed on them. And the working period depends on the nature of the given branch of production, the level of technique in the enterprise, which varies country by country, varies historically, etc. For example, in a spinning mill, not more than a few days are needed for a certain quantity of cotton to be transformed into yarn, ready to be sold, whereas in a locomotive works, the completion of each locomotive requires the work of a large number of workers over a long period. Now, this book is from the 50s, but the same principle still applies. How long does it take to make a candy bar? Not long. Depends how they do it. I mean, they would probably have to crush up some cocoa beans or something, pour in some sugar. They probably mix it in a huge pot. They probably have a machine that spits it out as formed candy bars, and then they package it. If the processing of the chocolate takes place, say, in a different country, then I guess it could take a while. But in any case, per unit, it's pretty quick. But if you're building a cargo ship, or say an oil tanker, it's gonna take a long time to build that. They build them pretty much custom made. They don't have a conveyor belt that spits out cargo ships. So it depends on what kind of things they're making. The time of production is usually longer than the working period because it includes those breaks in the work during which the object of labor is undergoing the operation of certain natural processes, for example, fermentation of wine, growth of crops, etc. Then there's also the circulation time. So circulation time is the period during which capital is transformed from money to the productive form and then back to money. Length of the time of circulation depends on the conditions under which the purchase of means of production and the sale of the completed commodities are carried out, the proximity of the markets, the level of development of the means of transport and communication. So this also greatly depends on what time period we're talking about. In the Middle Ages, this would have taken a long time. You gotta get on your cart and drive somewhere. In the Middle Ages, they had global trade. People would go from India to Europe, and it would take months, I think, on a ship. And paying money, you would have to go and physically hand over somebody a bunch of gold coins. Nowadays, it's much faster, of course. But it still depends. I think in selling food, for example, the circulation time is probably pretty quick, because food doesn't even last all that long. So you just take it to the store and pretty quickly it's sold, or it has to be thrown away. But if you're in the business of selling cars or computers or something, it probably takes a lot longer. If it's an expensive thing that doesn't spoil, then I would imagine getting it sold takes a longer time. But then again, if we're talking about food production, growing the crops takes longer than, say, making circuit boards. So the circulation time and the production time depend on the type of commodity. Next up, we have fixed and circulating capital. Now remember, industrial capital is the capital that's used for making commodities, and industrial capital is split into three phases: money capital, productive capital, and commodity capital. But the various parts of the productive capital do not circulate in the same way. The different ways in which separate parts of productive capital circulate derive from the different ways into which each of them transfers its value to the product. This underlies the division of capital into fixed and circulating. Fixed capital refers to that part of productive capital which fully takes part in production, transfers its value to the product, although not all at once, but in parts, during the course of a series of periods of production. This is the part of capital which is spent on the construction of buildings and plants and the purchase of machinery and equipment. You buy a building, maybe it lasts you 50 years, maybe 30 years, but during that period, the capitalist hopes it's gonna transfer its money into the products. Once that happens, the building is so worn out you have to repair it. Of course, they're gonna start repairs before that. They don't let it get to that point where it just collapses. They're working on it, renovating it bit by bit, kind of all the time. Same with the machines. The machines are eventually used up. They transfer their value to the products. That's the ideal. The capitalist wants that to happen, because the other option is that the machines and buildings just get somehow so outdated that they have to replace them anyway, even if they would otherwise still be good. So fixed capital, they wear out gradually, but it takes years. It's called physical depreciation of machinery and equipment. But besides physical depreciation, the instruments of production also undergo a so-called moral depreciation. I don't really know why it's called moral, because it has nothing to do with ethics or morality in that sense. It just means that it becomes outdated. A machine that's been used for 5 or 10 years, it may still work, may still be fine, but if technology has improved, if everybody else is using much better, faster, cheaper, more effective machines, then you have to replace it. Otherwise, you're not going to be competitive anymore. So it's a bit of a waste, and it's kind of unavoidable. It happens all the time. Although, what capitalists usually try to do, as far as I know, imperialist countries and corporations in imperialist countries, they get the newest machines, and then their old, worn out pieces of crap, they try to sell them to poorer countries, because in those countries they're still not morally depreciated. And they also do that with weapons. Imperialist armies, they tend to sell their decades-old, rusty hunks of garbage to poorer countries. But the capitalist is in a bit of a pickle because, of course, he wants machines that last for a while. He doesn't want them to break immediately. He doesn't want to have to get new ones all the time. But he's worried about moral depreciation, so then that gives him extra incentive to try to get the workers to work as fast as possible. Like, that's what happens at the factory where I work. We work night and day in 3 shifts, typically also weekends, so it's almost 24/7. With the soldering machines, there's like 15 minutes of cleaning between shifts, and that's it. And then like a half an hour cleaning once per week. But besides that, it's running night and day, because they want to get the maximum use out of it as fast as possible. And they're also very concerned that everybody works as fast as possible. Usually, it's honestly pretty Fordist. Like, Ford's way of increasing the intensity of labor was just speeding up the conveyor belts. And it's kind of like that. We are spurred on to work as fast as the machine goes. The limiting factor should be the speed of the machine and not the speed of us. Even though we of course get absolutely no compensation for working harder or faster. We just get yelled at if we're slow. Well, actually there is a compensation, but it's kind of funny. Like, I guess I'll tell you what the compensation is. Sometimes if you do like extra good, then the company will give you a cup of coffee at the factory cafeteria, which is, you know, how much is that worth? 50 cents? Sure, they charge you like 4 euros or something for a cup of coffee. Black coffee or coffee with milk. But if you made it yourself, which most people at the factory do, they make their own coffee. The price of a single cup is probably 50 cents, but you know, that's the compensation. It's honestly, it's very funny to me. But anyway. So the incentive is more, let's say, of a moral variety, not really monetary incentive. By circulating capital is meant that part of productive capital, the value of which during a single period of production is completely returned to the capitalist in the form of money when the commodities are realized. So it's just the money, basically. So there's the fixed capital and then the circulating capital. The circulating is the money, and this money is used to buy labor power, raw materials, fuel, and all those kinds of things, which do not form fixed capital, because fixed capital is the buildings and the machines and stuff like that. The value of the raw materials and all the fuel and auxiliary materials are also fully transferred to the commodities during a single period of production. So whereas with fixed capital it takes years for the value to gradually be transferred into the products, with circulating capital it's immediate. You got the raw materials, they instantly get transferred into the final product. And the labor power as well, but with labor power there's also the addition of surplus value. So during the time it takes for fixed capital to complete one turnover, circulating capital can have many turnovers. When the capitalist sells his commodities, he receives a certain sum of money which is made up of 1. The value of the part of the fixed capital that's transferred into commodities, 2. The value of the circulating capital, and 3. The surplus value. With the money, of course, he has to get new raw materials, pay salaries, but part of the money that corresponds to the part of the fixed capital that's been transferred to the commodities or depreciated, the capitalist uses that part of the money to gradually replace the depreciated tools, buildings, which is called amortization. So amortization means the gradual replacement in money form of the value of fixed capital through periodical deductions corresponding to the extent of its depreciation. So why it's called a deduction, it's just the money he could use for anything else, but he has to take a part of it, deduct part of his money, use it for repairs, partial replacement of worn out parts, worn out tools. But most of this money that he deducts for amortization, the capitalist puts in a bank and he keeps it there so it's ready to go when he wants to buy a new machine in place of an old one, or do some big renovation or build a whole new building in place of the old one or something. Now, I'm sure you remember from earlier episodes constant and variable capital. So Marxism distinguishes between types of capital in different ways. Constant and variable capital differ from each other in the roles which they play in the process. So constant is machines, variable is labor power, and it's called variable because it produces more value than it contains, whereas constant it just stays the same. But then fixed and circulating capital, they differ in the manner in which they circulate. However, bourgeois economics recognizes only the division of capital into fixed and circulating, since they don't like to recognize the fact that only labor creates value. The whole concept of variable capital is something that they very much dislike. Then lastly, we have annual rate of surplus value and ways of accelerating the turnover of capital. Now this is interesting because people often talk about the capitalists wanting to make turnover faster, but you might ask yourself, why do they care if it's fast as long as they get a bunch of money, right? Like, what's the benefit of having less money with fast turnover versus a lot of money with slower turnover if it's the same end result, right? Well, let's see. The speed with which a given amount of variable capital is turned over has a bearing on the amount of surplus value which a capitalist can extract from his workers during a year. So let's take two capitals as examples. Both of them have variable capital of $25,000 and the rate of surplus value is 100% each. So let's suppose that one of them is turned over once per year, whereas the other one gets turned over twice a year. This means that the owner of the second capital, though he possesses the same amount of money, is able to hire and exploit during 1 year twice as many workers as the owner of the first one, and at the end of the year, therefore, the first capitalist will have 25,000 of surplus and the second one will have 50,000. Now, this is because, the starting capital was 25,000 and the rate of profit was 100%. So they both still have the starting capital of 25,000, but on top of that they have the surplus. One of them has 25k, the other one has 50k. So, all else being equal, fast turnover is good, but it's more than that. Technically, maybe it wouldn't matter, like, okay, let's say you put in 1,000 and you get 10,000 out of it in a year, but then if you have faster turnover, let's say you put in 100 and you get 10,000 out of it after a year. When you think about it like that, the faster turnover means that you can get the same result with less capital, or if you think about it another way, with the same capital you can get way more. So faster turnover is better. The annual rate of surplus value means the proportion which the amount of surplus value produced per year bears to the variable capital invested. So in the previous example, this would mean that in the case of the first capitalist, the rate of profit is 100%. So 25k gets you 25k. But now that we're talking about the rate of surplus value, in the case of the first capitalist, the same. He invests 25k, he gets 25k out of it, 100% surplus value creation. But in the case of the second capitalist, because he can do it twice, his annual rate of surplus value is 200%. Marx showed that by itself, the acceleration of the circulation of capital does not create any new value. However, more rapid turnover of capital and more rapid realization in money form of the surplus value created in a given year enables the capitalist to hire, with one and the same quantity of capital, a larger number of workers whose labor creates a larger amount of surplus value per year. And if you would think about it as an exponential growth, like you hire some people, you exploit them, you get money, you put that money back in, you get even more money. The money grows all the time, and the more you put in, the more you get out. So if you're doing that faster than the other guy, then the difference between you two is gonna just get bigger and bigger over time if your turnover is always faster. And because of this reason, the capitalist strives to shorten the duration of the turnover, both the production time and the circulation time, and both of these depend on the level of the productive forces. So, for example, making leather, so tanning hides. Before the industrial era it took weeks, but in the 50s they were using chemicals, so it only took them hours. The textbook mentions that in a bunch of fields they use catalytic substances to speed up chemical processes. So whatever it is, if it's a chemical process that normally happens kind of by itself, for example tanning, in some kind of industrial chemical plant you can speed up the process into something much faster. Because in a way, time is money, and having to leave stuff out and wait for it to happen, even if it doesn't require any labor, just having to wait for it to happen involves costs, or at least there's an opportunity cost. That's opportunity cost is something that bourgeois political economy talks about, but it's a logical concept. Like, if you're doing something, it means you're not doing something else. So if you're having the stuff in a big vat, waiting for processes to happen to them, then that means you're not doing anything else to them. Whereas if you can make that process happen almost instantaneously, then you can already move to the second part, and the turnover gets faster, means you can just start it all over again, etc., etc. But, in order to accelerate the turnover, the employers also, they wanna lengthen the working day, intensify work. If the workers work 10 hours per day, then the working period might last 24 days. But if they lengthen the working day to 12 hours, then the working period would go down to 20 days. So the turnover would be faster. Now, of course, they could do 2 shifts, like they do in a lot of Finnish factories, because the working day is 8 hours and it's hard to extend that by a lot, so they just get 3 different shifts. So they can't really make us work much longer, but they try to make us work faster and harder. They want to, make you expend the energy you could expend in 70 minutes, make you expend it in 60 minutes. Shorten the break times or whatever it is. But yeah, that's the rotation of capital and the 3 forms of industrial capital. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.